A couple of quotes I put into your notes, I think. McNeill Dixon in his book, The Human Situation. The human mind is not, as philosophers would have you think, a debating hall, but a picture gallery. Around it hang our similes, our concepts. Metaphor is the essence of religion and poetry. Warren Wiersbe in his book, Preaching and Teaching with Imagination, which, by the way, is really, it's a bit dated, but it's a pretty good-sized book on how to preach with imagination. A lot of ideas in there. He said, we think in pictures even though we speak and write with words. We have forgotten that the bridge between the mind and the will is the imagination, and that truth isn't really learned until it's internalized. Imagination is the image-making faculty in your mind, the picture gallery in which you are constantly painting, sculpting, designing, and sometimes erasing. Illustrations. This is where certainly creativity comes in. Gave you a bit of a feel for illustration in our last one, and we do have quite a few of these resources on our website, free to use, obviously. Russ and Shirley do a great job with them. But there's something about the imagination that we don't want to forget when we come to preaching, because it really connects the mind and the will when you feel something in that sermon. So imagine that you are preaching on 1 Timothy 6, 9, and 10. The love of money is a root of evil. So you decide to use the story of Yusuf the Terrible Turk to illustrate this principle. Yusuf came to America in the 1930s to participate in a wrestling tournament. And he won the grand prize of $10,000, which in the 1930s was worth a lot more than it is today. Big grand prize. 2 days after winning the grand prize, Yusuf the Terrible Turk decided to go back home. He booked a passage on a ship headed back to Turkey. He wanted his winnings in gold coins because he didn't trust banks or bank checks. And he didn't think he could cash them in Turkey anyway. So he wanted all of his winnings put into gold coins. And he didn't trust the ship's safe deposit box. So he had a belt made up, and he put all of his gold coins into his belt, which he tied around his waist, attached to him. Nobody was getting that money from Yusuf the Terrible Turk, I'll tell you that. Well, a few days out to sea, they ran into some bad weather, and the engines malfunctioned, stopped working. And so another ship, they were stranded, so another ship comes along to rescue the people on the stranded ship. And they secured a passageway across the waves, and Yusuf is making his way, but the last bit he has to jump for the other ship. And he misses, and he falls down into the ocean. And that's the end of Yusuf the Terrible Turk, because he's dragged to the bottom of the ocean. And my friends, that is why I say to you that the love of money is the source of all evil. Now, what's wrong with that illustration?
That's evil.
What's that?
It wasn't evil. It was greed, mistrust.
Yeah, okay. Donald Sanukian, by the way, uses this as an example in his book for how not to illustrate. But he says in his book, and I would say to you today, I probably have told stories like this before in sermons or in various settings. You know, they have entertainment value. They're kind of interesting. But, of course, the problem is that, well, it's not pointless. I mean, it does make a point. But I'll remember the point the next time I win a wrestling match and I'm going across the ocean wearing a belt filled with gold and I fall into the ocean. That's when, I mean, it doesn't relate to us, to our lives. So illustrations are like dynamite. Used properly, they have powerful impact, but they can blow up in your face. I can remember times preaching over the years where I've given an illustration, and everybody, they loved the illustration, they got into the illustration, and nobody ever remembered the point of the text. Because all they remember is the illustration, and weeks later they tell me, hey, would you do that? Would you do that again, you know? Wait a minute, you missed the whole point. That's not going to be a good illustration. An illustration is supposed to make the point come alive and have them remember what the text has to say. Otherwise, you know, what good does it do? So illustrations should be applications, and the best illustrations end in an application and are connected to the text so that I remember the text when I think of the illustration. It's the goal of the illustration is to tie, remember application is the connecting of two things. It's to tie life with the text somehow. That's what an illustration is supposed to do. It's a form of exemplification. We talked about that earlier. So what are the purposes of illustrations? Why do we illustrate? Let me say this. Homiletics, the science of preaching, is, well, the principles of preaching. Homiletics is both a science and an art. The science part is how I construct that sermon, what are the principles of communication, how do I do my exegesis, how do I break down the passage, how do I put it all together. That's the science part. And we can teach science. We can say, here are the principles, here are the things you do, and we talk a lot about that in our seminars and in preaching classes and that sort of thing. But that's only part of preaching. The other part of preaching is the art. Preaching is also an art. And an art is, how do you teach art? I don't know. I'm not artistic. I'm not very creative. And yet in preaching, I have to become creative somehow because you're trying to make this thing come alive, not just be this outline. A sermon, by the way, is not an outline. An outline is not a sermon. You can have the best outline in the world, but it's not a sermon. The sermon comes alive in the moment of preaching it. That's when it comes alive. Until then, it's a dead thing. You can have the most beautiful sermon you want on paper. It's not, you're not preaching it until it comes alive with the people. That's when it happens. And so that's the art part. How does that happen? What are the angles, the creative issues, the ways that we approach it, the ways we shape it? All of that kind of thing is artistic. At the same time, creativity for the sake of being creative is pure vanity. It's not authentic. I hear a lot of sermons, and sometimes you can almost predict what the prevailing sermon will be for a while, especially in January, it seems like, where they've picked something, that was popular, and they've created a series of sermons out of that, and it's real creative, and it's real catchy and all of that, but it's not authentic, it's not real. So creativity just for the sake of creativity doesn't work. It has to be something that's solid because people will see through those attempts at creativity. So the art of preaching requires you to tap into your own personality. And each of you have a different personality. Phillips Brooks famously said preaching is truth through personality. It's your personality, and it's the creativity of your personality that makes it real and authentic. Illustrations are the best way to tap your creative genius, that is, how you do it. And that's different from someone else. I mean, you think about the biblical authors that God spoke through. Ezekiel is way different than Isaiah. Can you imagine Isaiah looking at Ezekiel and going, are you nuts? Way different personalities, both creative, but in their own ways. Same with you and me. How you tell a story makes all the difference in the world in your sermon to your listeners. So we have to begin with purpose. What are some purposes for illustrations? Well, to make truth memorable, first of all. There's an Arab proverb that says, the best speaker is he who turns ears into eyes. W.E. Sangster, an old Methodist preacher, said, people are convinced more by what they see than by what they hear. Illustrations help them see. Oh, Larry mentioned Haddon Robinson's, a mist in the pulpit is a fog in the pew. That's a great line. You can't build a skyscraper on a chicken coop foundation. That's Howard Hendricks. I love that. See, illustrations don't have to be lengthy. They can be very quick, very short. Howard Hendricks' statement there is a beautiful illustration, but it only is one sentence. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Jesus Christ. Illustration. Now, we live in a very visual world today, really visual world. So our illustration files, we've intentionally tapped into the visualization end of an illustration, graphics and those kinds of things, which you just saw a few minutes ago. We live in a very visual world, but even your words can develop visual. I mean, when Jesus said to somebody, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man into heaven, that's visual. They thought, wow, that camel, that eye of a needle. They visualized it. To make truth understandable is the second purpose. You want abstract truth to become understandable, clarity. So if something is abstract, an illustration can make it concrete. Christ used parables to make abstract truth concrete. Again, back to the abstraction ladder. You're going up and down that abstraction ladder. So if you've got an abstract concept you're trying to get across, then that's a good time to stop and get some kind of an illustration, an example that will bring that home in a visual and practical way. To make truth motivational. So illustrations like songs or movies. Why do movies and songs work so well? Because they get inside of us and they motivate us. They move us. They're visual, they're vivid, they're concrete. Imagination is the lifeblood of inspiration, motivation. Theologian Kevin Van Hooser labels it in his book, Hearers and Doers, he labels it a social imaginary. And he goes so far to say that the decline in Western Christianity, the decline we're experiencing in our world today, is because a secular social imaginary controls the minds of our people. So they don't make decisions guided by the Bible and theology. They make their decisions based upon the social imaginary that has taken over their thought processes. He calls it the incredible, shrinking, evangelical imagination. We're apparently not very imaginative. And we're not connecting with people. But on Sunday morning we preach a sermon, and then all week long they're watching movies and all of these things that are more powerful, more controlling in terms of their social imaginary than our one little pedantic exegetical sermon. That's what he means when we're not, we have a shrinking evangelical imagination. I think part of that is because over the years we've almost turned some of the things that were read and watched and sort of that, we sort of put those down as if, well, those aren't important, and yet those are very imaginative things taking place in our culture. Whether it's Star Wars, you know what I'm talking about. So they get people's minds. So a person can listen to an analytical sermon on biblical principles, but it doesn't counteract the social imaginary that shapes their thinking all week long. So here's the thing. If we're going to make disciples, we need to change their social imaginaries so that the stories and metaphors of the Bible shape the way they live today. So you can read Psalm 126 and the grain and things like that, and you can analyze that, or you can tell a story like Russ did from Del Tar, that captures more of the social imagination to understand the principle. So we have to use biblical imaginations to tap into their imaginations, because that's the only way we're going to remake them. All right, to make truth applicational, obviously, you can take an abstract truth, make it specific. There's a difference between, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, between relevance and application. Relevance means that we make truth relate to people's lives in our world today. It's much broader than application. And application is telling somebody what to do or how to do it. We can give a specific example of how something might be applied. However, specificity might not relate to everyone because it's so specific. So we have to vary our stories and our metaphors to relate to a wide variety of people out there. One kind of story hits somebody one way, hits somebody else a different way, or doesn't connect at all. So, if you love football, and all you ever give are illustrations about football, you just cut off a whole lot of people. You might have identified well with a few people. That's why our illustrations have to be constantly moving and changing and relating in various ways to people's lives. Let me talk about something that sounds really crazy, eidetic imagery. So, an artist sees with their minds. I have a friend who's an artist, and he sits and paints something down there, and I go, wow, where did that come from? I don't know, I saw it in my mind. I don't see stuff like that in my mind. But artists see things with their minds. When we tell a story, as if we can see it or feel it in our minds and in our emotions, then in our listeners' minds and emotions, they will see it and feel it. John Reed was teaching a class in college on oral interpretation. And he had a student named Irene, and he assigned Irene to read a short story aloud for the class. And it was Eugene Field's Little Boy Blue. Now, Little Boy Blue is a story, about a poem actually, about a family whose little boy died, and the parents refused to change anything in the little boy's room because they couldn't cope with the loss. So Irene read the story to herself, and then she told her professor, she said she couldn't do it. She told him she had a similar experience in her life. She didn't think she could handle the emotional impact of reading the poem in class. So she didn't want to do it. She was afraid she would break down and cry because of her past history. So he told her to practice reading it out loud. He's a good speech professor, right? Practice reading this thing out loud and until you can do it in front of the class. So she came to class and she read the poem. And as she read, the members of the class were very moved emotionally. They saw the images from their own experiences in their minds. John Reed, the professor, said that he was transported back as she was reading in his mind to the room where his little brother grew up, which powerfully moved him into this emotional response to her reading this story in speech class. And he hadn't expected it. Well, the poem's about 3 minutes long, but about 2/3 of the way through the poem, he said the screen in his mind went blank. Nothing there. He didn't feel anything anymore. She continued to read the poem, but he no longer saw any images, no longer felt anything. When she was done, he asked the rest of the class, did something happen to you in the middle of that reading? And they all said, yeah, about 2/3 of the way through, I didn't feel anything anymore. I didn't see anything anymore. He turned to her and he said, what happened to you? And she said, well, you said I might lose control and start crying while reading this poem. That began to happen to me, so I turned it off. He said, what did you turn off? She said, I have no idea. I just went to get control and turned it off. She turned off her emotions, she turned off what she was seeing in her head, all of that sort of thing. Her emotional screen went blank. Well, when that happened, everybody in the audience had the same experience. This is what this technical term means, eidetic imagery. See, there's kind of an inner projector in all of us that runs with pictures from our experiences in life. And when a speaker taps into those pictures with his or her experience, what do? We aren't identifying with their experience. We're seeing in our mind and feeling in our heads or in our hearts the emotions of our experience. And when we tap into our imaginations, as we illustrate biblical truths so that we see and feel an illustration, then we will tap into the imaginations of our people so that they will see and feel. You can tell an illustration, you can tell a story, you can read a story with very little impact on people's lives. We do it all the time as preachers because we have to preach. But when you tell a story that elicits out of you some emotional experience, some visual thought process, something from your experience, then people in the audience tap into their similar experiences and supply their experiences into the story, and now the illustration and the application have much more power. That's when an illustration becomes that pin drop moment, because they're feeling it, because you're feeling it as you tell it. I'm going to tell you something. It goes back to eidetic imagery. So when Russ and Shirley first sent me that video to look over and review and see if there were any revisions we need to make, that kind of thing, I watched it and I was emotionally moved by the video. And I had to stop and think why. Because I have an autistic daughter and she works as a bagger in a grocery store at Hannaford. So what happened to me when I was listening to the story was not Johnny the Bagger. What happened to me was visualizing and feeling my experience with my daughter. So I said something to Russ. And Russ said, well, when I told that story, it moved me because I have a son who has some disabilities and works in a store as an actor. What's going on? As he told the story, he was feeling and seeing in his own mind and heart his son. He told a story about Johnny the Bagger. The story about Johnny the Bagger made me think of my daughter and her experiences. That's what we mean by eidetic imagery. And it starts to change the social imaginary of the person listening. That's the power of illustration. Not just telling a story, but seeing and feeling it. And your audience seeing and feeling their experiences. Now, here's the thing. And And we can teach speech, we can teach communication principles all we want. We can tell somebody how to tell a story, and we can give them, well, you gotta use your vocals, you gotta be louder, softer, all of these kinds of principles of communication and all of that kind of thing. But it's mechanical if that's all they're doing, is following a set of principles about communication, about speaking. But if your speaking, his voice, is the product of what he's feeling, then it comes out. So, on the abstraction ladder again, an illustration is actually a specific, it's not a general. You're getting specific with something like you just said. But if we tried to make that a general, then it loses its impact. But if we make it specific, it's a concrete thing, then the person listening turns that into something that's more general to their lives. Absolutely, exactly the way communication works. I just think that sometimes when we're giving illustrations, we're giving them because we have to give an illustration. You know, we have to find some, oh, I gotta find something here that gives an illustration. And it doesn't work. There's no such thing as a good or bad illustration, they like to say. There are only good and bad illustrations of something. So what we need to do is think carefully through that. Now, look, let's face it, we preach week in and week out. So you can't have that killer illustration every Sunday. It just doesn't work. But there are times when you will find that that process really plays out, and that's when it becomes very powerful. But back to this concept of what we're trying to do with illustrations is change the social imaginary of the listener. Not just analytically, this is what they need to know, but they need to think, feel, see what we're talking about. Okay, how do we illustrate? Well, lots of different ways. Robert Stein lists a whole bunch of ways that Jesus illustrated. Oh, by the way, here's an interesting quote. Phil Jensen and Paul Grimond. If you're not boring when you emerge from theological college, you probably didn't learn anything. 5 years out of college, if you're still boring, you have a problem. That's pretty good. Bruce Shelley says that Jesus preached like an artist paints. So, he used all of these illustrations. Metaphor, simile, allegory. I think I put all these in your notes, couldn't I? Yeah, I didn't want to go through the list, but all of these are illustrations that Jesus used. He was very illustrative. He was not boring. People enjoyed listening to him. And there are other kinds of illustrations as well. Analogy. 1 Corinthians 12 and the human body, Paul. Anecdotes. Those are testimonies, stories. Historical events, biographical accounts, quotations. There's lots of ways that the scriptures use and illustrate things. I want to just say something about quotations for a minute. Quotes rarely in a sermon work real well because they tend to intrude between the speaker and the listener. That is, whenever you quote somebody, you have a third party interjecting into it, into the communication process. That doesn't mean you should never quote, obviously. But it's especially true in conclusions. It's very common for people to learn that when you get to the conclusion, then what you do is come out with your killer quote, or a poem, or something, right? But that's really the least effective conclusion. I do another seminar on conclusions. That's really not a very effective conclusion. Quotes have value, but if we're going to quote, we quote because an authority is needed to make a point credible. That is, we're making a statement about something that somebody's going to question and say, well, wait a minute, how do you know that? So we quote because the source is a credible source of information. And secondly, we quote because someone said it better than I could ever say it. Okay, I can see that. Those are two good reasons to quote. But when we quote, we should always cite the quote as a quote, not your own words. Don't pretend that you came up with this. You don't have to necessarily name the person or that. You can say, an author wrote this, or somebody said that, so you can do it. A writer put it this way, or I heard this from a speaker. It's just a quick way to say, this isn't my words, but it's a quote. And you should always make sure that you know the source of what you're doing. I mean, you never want to get into plagiarism. By the way, this whole AI thing is really raising an issue of plagiarism with preaching too, because they're pulling stuff from all over the internet. How do you give credit? But anyway, that's another side. I just wrote a blog on that. Visual aids. Jesus used visual aids a lot, actually. Cartoons, we can use them, graphs, pictures, charts, PowerPoint. There are sources like preachingtoday.com and others that have a wealth of image material, Google, all of that. By the way, here's one from the Reformation. The Reformation began in 1522. Huldrych Zwingli in Zurich protested against the tradition of fasting during Lent. So he preached a sermon against fasting during Lent, against it. And what he did to illustrate his sermon is he cut up and distributed 2 sausages for the congregation to eat during the sermon, to show people that the traditions of the Roman Catholic Church had overshadowed biblical truth. So as they're learning this principle, they're eating the sausages during church. Well, that's a great visual aid. I had one preacher who will remain nameless, but he told me that he was so frustrated with his congregation because people just didn't show up sometimes for a responsibility they had at church, or even to church sometimes, just because they were busy, they didn't feel like it, they had other things and they just didn't feel like it. So he started his sermon one Sunday by telling his congregation that he just didn't feel like preaching today. And then he closed his Bible, walked down the center aisle and out the back and went to his car. And he sat in his car for about 10 minutes while they tried to figure out what to do. And then he went back in and explained his illustration. I don't know, that takes guts. I would think they'd probably leave. I'd probably think, I don't have a congregation when I get back. I can't leave them 10 minutes. But they were there and they tried singing some songs. They just tried to make do. I don't know how it worked, but that was a visual aid. I don't think it's something that I would try, but maybe I'm not as bold as some people. But visual aids is another one. Let's talk about some approaches to illustrating. And pastors approach illustrations with different mindsets. Some tend to illustrate a lot, others rarely. But there are a couple of rhetorical arguments in Greek rhetoric that we do use quite a bit. One is the specific to general. The application moves from the general to the specific. So you're preaching on 1 Timothy 6, you'll move from the general principle, love of money, to specific applications. Or you can move from the specific to the general. You're preaching on 1 Corinthians 11 and the head covering. Now, unless you believe that the head covering is a literal thing, and maybe some of you do, you will move from a specific cultural practice in the first century to a general principle. There's lesser versus greater arguments. The application moves sometimes from the greater to the lesser. So you're preaching on John 15. You'll have to move from the greater persecutions maybe that other people in, say, North Korea face to the opposition that we face. You're a greater to lesser there. Or lesser to greater. This is a form of the a fortiori argument. You might use this if you're preaching from, say, John 15:13, where Jesus says there's no greater love than that one lay down his life for his friends. So you use the illustration of a soldier sacrificing his life for his friends. and then pivot to the greater sacrifice of Christ, lesser to greater. Altitude and attitude. Imagine that you're preaching your sermon like flying a plane. Mark Deaver talks about altitude, meaning you cover a lot of material, then you're flying at a high altitude. When you cover less material, you're flying at a lower altitude. But I like to think of it in applications and illustrations. If I'm flying high, my applications and illustrations are more general, more universal. If I'm flying low, my altitude is low, my illustrations and applications tend to be more specific and concrete. So maybe if I'm preaching on 1 John 4:16, God is love, and the one who loves abides in God, you can do some general applications, some overall kinds of things, and use a biblical illustration. You're flying high. But if you're flying low, you're going to get down into something like, how do you love that mean coworker, or something like that. You're going to get low. Attitude is the other one. A friend of mine was a private pilot. He would occasionally call me to go flying with him. It was a float plane, so we'd take off from a lake in Maine early in the morning. We'd fly to another lake, land, and go into a restaurant for breakfast, come out, go back in the plane, fly back. One time we were flying, and he said, do you want to fly the plane? Okay. There's a dual control. So he said, okay. He gave me a few instructions, and so I'm flying the plane. And we're going along. Now, my friend had had a heart attack a number of years earlier, and all of a sudden he slumps down over the controls as if he was having a heart attack. And I went, what? And then he jumps up, he's laughing, he's teasing me. I said, you gave me a heart attack. I don't know how to fly this thing. But in the process, he said, one of the things you got to watch is your attitude. What's an attitude in flying? Anybody know? Well, it's on there. But it has to do with your pitch and your sideways, the angle. It has to do with whether your pitch is high or low, whether your angle is this way or that. So attitude in preaching is the biblical text, and whether your attitude is toward God or toward people, that's pitch up and down, or your angle is this way or that way. You can take that text and your angle can be very different with a group of teenagers than your angle will be with a group of senior citizens. Same text, but your attitude is different. So just remember those kinds of things. Let's talk about the sources of illustrations. Source for illustrations. When my kids were small, I could use them as illustrations. As they grew up, no way. My daughter did. She would warn me if we were on vacation, this better not come up in a sermon. You know, my personal illustration library was lost. But there's lots of sources for illustrations, personal experience, reading. There's the sermon illustration stuff like preachingtoday.com and all of that stuff, that kind of thing. But instead of boring you with lists, I'd like Russ to join me up here. Russ is good at illustration, and we're going to try and answer any questions you might have about how to find good illustrations. I'll just start by explaining my process over the years was a simple one. If I was preaching on something, I would find a book that related to that, and I would read books. And as I went through the books, I would flag good illustrations in the books. And those would be photocopied, and they'd be put on a file card, and then I filed those in this massive file card file that I had, which is now gone. I told this to Mark when he first started as pastor. He said, you use file cards? Yeah. This is old school, man. And after a while, I'd give the book with my markings to the secretary, and she would do it. And then whenever I needed an illustration, I could go to my card file under topics and find an illustration. So that was one of the ways I did it. And you know, there are certain writers they're just full of stories. You know, Chuck Swindoll was Philip Yancey, all of these guys, they're full of stories. So you can find all kinds of great stories if you do that. That was the way over the years I did it with my personal reading. So every time I started a series, I would pick 5 or 6 books that I would read in preparation for that. And then I would mark them all up and get some illustrations. But let's talk about how do you find illustrations? I think go ahead, Russ. Do you have anything to?
Oh, I did exactly what Dave did. I've still got the files with all the file cards. After a while, that got to be really tedious for me. So one of the good things that you can do that I started doing, and this goes a long way to relating to your congregation as well, is I would got people in the congregation to read, and anything they came across that they thought that, because they knew my preaching after so many years, that I would use as an illustration in a sermon, to cut those things out of a newspaper or a magazine, or just jot down a note of where they found it and give it to me. And so I would get these things from the people in the congregation, and then I'd go and hunt them down if they didn't particularly have the text, and use them. Sometimes it would be good ones. Other times I'd get this stuff and I'm like, what were you thinking? I couldn't possibly use this in public. But that works. And movies, books, I think probably the most important thing for me was reading. Just if you're a reader and you read a lot of books, I would find authors that really were good at using illustrations, and I'd read everything they wrote, and just again mark those things out.
But yeah, you're going to run into it. So a lot of times, if you tell a story, and it's from the life of somebody that also has lots of other issues, and especially today politically, if they're you'll get. I've gotten feedback from people who say, that was, but how can you glorify this person who lives this way or acts that way or speaks like this? Well, I'm not glorifying that person, but this little story was true. And so you're right. That's one of the factors we plug into the process. Is it worth it to use that story if it's going to generate those kinds of responses? Then probably it's not worth it. Yeah, there have been many times when I'm preaching or getting ready to preach that week, and I think of the perfect illustration, and I contact the person and say, is it okay if I use this illustration, whether it's a family member or somebody else. There are other times I might warn them that this is coming up. Is that okay? It's sort of asking permission, I suppose. And there are times, honestly, Dan, where I have this great illustration, this great thing. This would be perfect for the sermon, I think. Now, I can't use that because of confidentiality, because it would be wrong for these people, and somebody would know. One of the things we do with illustrations sometimes, we use a story in one context that came from another context, right? Because they're far away, they won't know that I used it here. It's amazing how the Christian grapevine works. And they hear about you using it. So yeah, there are times when I just decide, no, I can't use it. It may be the perfect illustration, but this was confidential, or this is something that I really don't have the right to use, or it would be hurtful, that kind of thing. So sometimes I just don't use it then. You're right.
And it's even worse when you're on the radio. Somebody out there thinks you're talking about them.
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah. So you have to be careful with those things, absolutely. But yeah, I've often asked permission. I have occasionally asked forgiveness to you. And I hadn't thought, I don't listen to a lot of podcasts, so, but today that's another source. That's clever though. I hadn't thought about how you could stop it, write down some notes or something, because that's the problem I have with, if I listen to podcasts, is that there was a great thing there I wanted to keep, and now I can't remember where it was, and how to find it. That's a great idea. But yes, Jesus was a master illustrator, very much so. And Robert Stein, the material that I just threw in the notebook, is all about that in his book. But yes, absolutely. I really think the biggest thing today is authenticity. People want to hear authentic voices. They want to know that that person is real. And so illustrations, sharing some personal things, like Russ just said, very, very powerful.